Right, and the hand on the clock says we're set to go. So our next presenter is Henny Swan, and I'm going to be very lazy and just read her short biography from our website. So Henny has worked in accessibility for 13 years, specialises in mobile and video on demand. Currently, she works at the BBC on iPlayer, standards and guidelines, and media player accessibility. And if we're all set, Henny, I'll pass over to you.
Okay, thank you. Can everybody hear me?
It sounds good to me.
Yep. Fantastic. All right. Thanks, Pat. And before I get started, thank you, TPG. I know you pulled this out the bag in literally 3 or 4 weeks. So I'm really impressed. Well done. And thank you for the invite. It's a pleasure to be involved alongside so many good speakers. So I work at BBC and I sit within the UX&D, user experience and development, and advise teams on how to make their products accessible, as well as really sort of help put into place the systems and processes that we need in order to do that. So when I joined BBC, I received a complaint from a guy called Colin, who was a screen reader user. And he said to me, I'm having a real problem, one, using the media player, but secondly, I can't just get to my content. I'm really finding it difficult to do. Now, I knew that the site had been built with accessibility in mind. I knew it had been tested with some automated testing tools. So I knew that there was a structure there and I had used it myself. So I called him up and I said, if you like, I will have my screen reader running, you have your screen reader running, and we will try and find what it is you're trying to get to, which was a particular radio show. And I realized super quickly as we were navigating through the page together that despite there being accessibility built into the page, despite there being a heading structure, it just was not usable for this user, and I would argue for all types of users. There were a number of things that just weren't working in the page. Firstly, massive link overload, in that there were a huge amount of links on the page, but some of them were duplicated. So I've got a picture here on screen of the website, of iPlayer, and a circle around an image link, as well as image text that accompanies that image, which is also a link. They were basically presented as two separate links. So you get duplicated information, and the alt text was descriptive of the image, didn't really tell you where the link was going to. So there was a huge link overload on the page. And looking at it, I realized that, in fact, the information that was really relevant to your tools, if you want, for getting to where you wanted to go, were buried quite deep down the page. So if you look at the iPlayer navigation, you have TV and radio. That's essentially the navigation. And then you have featured and most popular with a list of programs. And then down below after that, you then have TV channels, an A to Z heading, and a categories heading. So the primary information was not high up within the page. Tabbing around the page, I realized that really there was a lot of issues around content order and how the tab focus was managed. So in the categories module, for example, you have a vertical list of all the categories. And on the right of that list, whichever category you have selected, there is another list of 4 items within that category. Tabbing through the page, if you had, say, children selected, for example, you'd have to tab through all the other links within the categories before you could get to the content within the module. So the tab order was not managed correctly. The same issue applied to the TV channels, where we had a vertical list of TV channels, and then to the right of that list, when you had a channel selected, you were able to cycle through and see the schedule. Again, you were forced to go through all the TV channels, and then you had to go back to the channel that was selected. Equally, the schedule was squished into a little kind of carousel, so you'd have to hit the next and previous button in order to see the next 4 items or the previous 4 items. In addition to that, for both the categories links and for the channel links, your first click would reveal content within the page, and then a second double click would take you to the page in question, which of course is incredibly confusing. So there was no standard keyboard behavior. That single click, double click thing was confusing for everybody that I saw using the page. And then you had additional key presses. So the additional key presses on the carousel for next and previous, just to reveal another 4 items, was a lot of hard work for people to do. So what makes an accessible product? I'm just going to decrease the font size here because it looks like we have gone off piste slightly. What makes an accessible product? Well, at BBC we have something called our global experience language, which is our visual language, and really ideally in there we need to embed some of the accessibility requirements. We've also recently published the BBC Mobile Accessibility Standards and Guidelines, a set of agnostic guidelines that allow you to build accessible HTML content, but also native apps. So we have techniques within there. So our developers can go and look up the techniques. Our QA teams can go and look up evaluation criteria. We also have assistive technology testing guidelines, which gives you an outline of these are the assistive technologies you should be using when testing, these are the versions, and this is when you should be testing. We also have automated testing, and then we are also looking at putting together a whole bunch of feature files and cucumber tests around accessibility that the whole of future media can use. So do these things make an accessible product? I would argue that yes, they do, but I've gone the wrong way. But standards and guidelines are not a guarantee of inclusive design. So I have on screen a picture of a pavement, and there is a lowered, the pavement is lowered so that you can get onto the pavement using a wheelchair or a pram, or if you've got a wheelie suitcase. But on the other side of the pavement, there's another step leading to a path, and then that path leads 2 steps. And that very much indicates to me how teams work. There might be one team who can get the pavement right, as it has done in this picture, but then there's another team, let's say editorial, who've got no idea about it at all, and they don't get the next stage right. And then you might have another team who are just designing steps in a way that are not inclusive. So inclusive design reflects on everybody within the whole process and cannot be left to development and developers alone. So standards and guidelines, assistive technology test plans, test frameworks are not enough in my mind. They are simply a tool. They're resources for people to go and get support in order to do their job correctly. I think the huge thing that's missing with all of this is they don't cover usability for people with disabilities either. And that is really where kind of WCAG and most standards and guidelines don't quite do the job. I think for me, accessibility is not just about making things usable and making things technically accessible for disabled users. It's about adding value. And standards and guidelines won't emphasize that. So they won't say, you know what, this feature really, really is beneficial for these types of users, and here's the reason why. So it doesn't help you prioritize what features you should put out within an app or website. And they're often referenced only by QA and development, and they're often referenced way too late in the process. And of course, they don't speak the language of designers. They're clunky, they're difficult, they're often text-based, they don't explain things visually. I often think of it as being a little bit like reading War and Peace, which I read when I was young, free and on the dole. Where the war parts of the book bored me a little bit, and the peace parts, the story, really I found much more enjoyable. And I think for people working within UX, they're going to look at standards and guidelines and go, I'm sorry, I don't have the time, it's not my area. And then they say, let's go get an expert in who can help us. And that could lead off to having kind of specialism silos. And people just at the end of the day go, you know what, just tell me what I need to do and I'll go and do it. But for me, the key to making accessible and usable and fun products that people want to use and can use, the magic ingredient is user experience, and that's where I feel we need to really focus our efforts at the moment. if you get really good user experience involved with a true understanding of the end user and different types of disability types, you end up with products which are accessible but you would never really know it, or things which are a lot less clinical. I have a picture on screen of a lady called Amy Mullins who lost both her legs, and she was invited by Jean-Paul Gaultier to walk in one of his catwalk shows, and he made her some bespoke wooden legs which are carved and extremely beautiful. And this is kind of an extreme example of how, you know, prosthetic limbs don't have to be just functional, they don't have to be painful on your stump. You can have things that feel good and look good. In the middle there's an image of the Bradley timepiece, which is up for a Design of the Year award in London at the London Design Year this year. It's a watch that's built with people with low vision in mind, where the hands are represented by ball bearings, and it looks beautiful. It's tactile, and I think more importantly, often people who are blind will have a speaking watch or a braille watch, and they don't look great. And if you're in a meeting and you want to find out the time, it's very obvious what you're doing as well. You can look at more examples of this, of everyday design in everyday life that is inclusive, in a book by Graham Pullen, called Design Meets Disability, and I strongly recommend you read that. So there are four approaches to inclusive design. I'm sorry, my slides keep jumping around for some reason. Let me just take it down a little bit. There are 4 ways to approach inclusive design. And this is beyond the guidelines, beyond standards, and this is something that we talk about with our teams all the time within BBC. So for me, it's all about offering choice. Users don't want to be told what to do and how to do it. People will have their own way of doing things. So I got an image up on screen here of some gardening tools on the side of a shed, and the text above it says, "In case of zombies or yard work." You don't ever know quite how someone is going to use your product. And it's very bad to assume that you do know how someone will use your product. Nintendo Wii, when they came out, had absolutely no idea that in a matter of weeks, that lots of people will be using it for physical therapy and rehab from injuries or ongoing illnesses. And they kind of coined the phrase "wehab" for people who were starting to use it in that way. So be really flexible about your expectations, and don't put people in disability silos. So offering choice can translate into offering different ways of doing things. We all have different preferences. So does a screen reader user, so does someone with learning difficulties, and so does someone with hearing loss. So provide multiple means of completing the same action. On screen now I have a picture of our categories menu in the recently relaunched iPlayer, yesterday in fact. And it's a drop-down menu, and in it we have sections for audio described and signed. The obvious thing for us was to make sure that there were clear categories where people could quickly go for that particular content. There's no category for subtitles, by the way, because all catch-up content is subtitled. However, when iPlayer launched, we went into preview about a month and a half ago, and on the British Blind Computer Association list, there was a comment saying, "I think it's unfair that as a blind user, I am told to go and find content for me in the audio described section. I want to browse iPlayer and find my type of content and what I like, regardless of audio description or not." So what we did already have, and that I needed to point out, was any page that has a listing, whether it be an individual program page or search results, as I have up on screen here, we will indicate what formats things are in. So this particular one that's listed, the Crimson Field, is in high definition and audio description. But some might be also signed as well. So there's multiple ways to find what you want to do. And it's also multiple ways to complete an action. On the iPlayer native app on iOS, I've got 3 screenshots here showing how you can delete items. So in the first one on the left, we have an edit button. you can hit the edit button, you can then navigate down the list and you can select items and then choose the delete button. Not everybody wants to do that. Some people find that complex and difficult to comprehend. It's also a lot of hard work. So for others, the easier thing to do is what's on the right, which is just to simply swipe and delete, which is also a familiar gesture across all sorts of different types of apps. So there's multiple ways to complete stuff. And also give users choice over formats. Again, don't assume you know who wants to listen, who wants to watch content with subtitles or not, or have audio description, sign language, etc. So always provide those switches so you can switch between the different formats. Our research shows that we have a very significantly high percentage, and I don't have the actual number, of users who are not deaf and who use subtitles. They might be people who are watching second screening, so maybe the kids are watching something on TV and they're watching something on their device, in the middle of the night, feeding babies, at work, all sorts of different scenarios. We even had one lady in user testing who said, oh, I use subtitles when I'm blow drying my hair. Fair enough. We also provide people with the means to make a decision as to what format they want to download when they're in a program page, so if they want to change their mind about the format as well. The other thing I am very, very keen on is that we give users control over the page. It's really important that people can customize their experience and use things in a way that makes sense to them. Now, it's not always possible to do everything, but there are certain things that we should be thinking of. So, for example, don't automatically update or change the page. So when you're designing, think about what is the behavior of this module. Can every different type of user access it? Do I need to think about progressive enhancement? Do I need to think about an alternative way of presenting it? So things like infinite scroll that we see on Twitter or Facebook or a lot of social networking apps can be, if not done correctly, a real nightmare for people because you're just stuck in this loop of endless tweets. So consider adding in pagination, as these two wireframes show the difference between pagination and infinite scroll. Also provide alternatives or mechanisms to stop or pause content. And again, I had a situation recently where we had auto-updating content and the design had not accommodated a pause button, and so we had to go back and shoehorn it in, which is never really a good feeling because it's never going to satisfy design and they're not going to be happy because it messes around with everything. But had it been included from the outset, it would have felt more seamless in design. And at the foot of the page, I've got a screen grab of a live news feed that auto-updates, where you have a pause button so you can stop it, but also crucially, it has a forward and back button. So in case you didn't have time to read what the previous one was, you can go back and read it again. So it's giving people control. As designers, we need to make sure we support Zoom and the ability to Zoom on devices. This is probably the one thing that I get the most pushback on when I'm talking to teams or individuals about accessible design. Many people say, you know what, we don't need to worry about it because devices have their own Zoom functionality and our site is responsive, so when you go down onto mobile, the text enlarges anyway and it looks much clearer anyway. I've seen in countless user testing so many people painfully just flicking their fingers, trying to zoom up and not understanding why they can't do it. There used to be a bug in iOS 6, and prior to iOS 6, where if you moved from portrait to landscape, the image didn't display correctly for a few seconds. So a lot of people didn't like Zoom, but that's been fixed since iOS 6. And in fact, if you want to switch Zoom on your products now, it's relatively easy to test. Another thing teams say to me is, oh no, we've got to go over everything and we've got to test all the devices. We don't have that capacity. In actual fact, when we enabled Zoom on a web product recently, it was minimal testing and there were minimal issues with changing it over. Control is very, very significant when we come to gaming and audio video. Everybody needs and interacts with games differently, and also will have different needs when it comes to sound. We work on a framework for games within BBC, and we're looking at the ideas around having a settings panel where you can switch on audio, or you can leave audio on but switch music off, or you can change the sound effects and so forth. You can switch audio description on and off, and subtitles, so you can really customize your experience. Maybe you find it difficult to have background sounds, perhaps you have Asperger's or autism, so switching off the background sound is good, but you want to keep the audio description on just to enable you to understand the game better. I think iOS 7 is interesting in how they approach control and customizing your experience. In the settings, you can go and within the Generals tab, you'll find that there is a tab to go to accessibility, which is shown in the image here, just sort of a third of the way down. What I found really fascinating with iOS 7 is text size was taken out of the accessibility tab and moved up a level. So it sits outside of accessibility, and I can only think that that's because they had a lot of feedback from users going, we need to be able to resize text. And that really got me thinking. Obviously, a lot of users don't identify with accessibility as being somewhere where they can go and fix things, which brings up the issue of, do people understand the word? I've, again, in user testing, with links to accessibility help, people have not understood what that is. The one thing that I'm kind of interested in seeing is perhaps if iOS were to take away that accessibility level altogether and make it more of a word that speaks to everybody, like customize or personalize my experience. What they do in iOS 7 as well in terms of control, which is great, is they allow users to, deaf users or any type of user who uses subtitles, to customize your subtitles. So you can go in and you can change the font, the size, the color, background colors, opacity, text opacity, text edge style, text highlights, everything. We did a lot of research in BBC many moons ago, pre-mobile, around this. And I think this is an area of research where we really need to go and revisit what is appropriate across different screens and devices. And I'm very interested in how iOS do that and how people are using it. So be familiar as well. Build in familiarity into your product. So all users, regardless of who you are, what your ability is, we all understand familiar patterns and paradigms, and this is really what you need to be using when designing your products. For screen reader users, for example, on iOS and Android in native apps, there is a library of standard UI components, and these come with accessibility built in. And by that, what I mean is they come with a label, which you obviously need to customize. It's your alternative. They come with a trait, so it tells you whether it's a button or a link, which is key because that's something that a screen reader will pick up. And then it will give you a hint, which is almost like a tooltip of how to understand how to interact with the product. Now, if you were to build your own custom component rather than use that standard one, you need to go and add all that stuff in. So automatically you're opening it up to be more vulnerable to making mistakes. Users also know how to interact with standard components, whether it be on the web or in native apps. They hear them everywhere, they see them everywhere, they know what the gestures are, they know what the keyboard access keys are, all of that kind of thing. On the bottom of the slide here, I have a screen grab of the navigation in the iPlayer app, and it's essentially a footer, and it's got 5 items in it. With voiceover running, you would hear selected TV 1 of 5. So you know that you're on the selected tab for TV, and you know it's in the list of 5. Buttons or links, and I strongly recommend that you go and read Carl Grove's recent blog post about this. It was really, really good. I'll pop a link in the box later. This is just a small corner of where you need to use familiar things for familiar tasks. Buttons, and this is a very simplified kind of top-level look, buttons trigger a change in the page, submit data or prompt an update. Links, on the other hand, typically open a new resource or a new page. When a screen reader user, you might think, what's this got to do with design and screen readers? But when a screen reader user encounters a button on desktop, they know to hit the spacebar. If it's a link, they know to hit the return key. So if you muddle those things round, you're going to start muddling with people's expectation of how to navigate. So I took a screen grab of a banking website where we have two products, Simple Borrowing and Home Insurance, and each of them has what looks like a button underneath, a Find Out More button. And in fact, it has been coded as a button as well. But in reality, it links to a new page. It's just simply a link. So this is just styling. So you need to be really careful that you make it very clear within your UX, within your designs, what it is that every single element is. The other thing I talk about a lot is adding value. I touched upon that earlier. So we're not talking about the bread and butter of making things accessible or even usable. What we're talking about is how can we add value to this product? How can we add value to this website and this native app to make it even easier to do things and more fun to do things? I have a picture on screen of a wheelchair that's been souped up with a jetpack and some really big wheels so it can go off-roading. Hat tip to Ian Pouncey for that slide. So that would be, you'd think that would be a great thing to do. Yeah, everybody would like to have a wheelchair with a jetpack on it. But the key thing to remember when you're adding value is to not make assumptions. Be careful. We don't really know what people want, so you need to always go back to the user to ask if what you are doing is adding value. A couple of things that we've looked at recently, and this is probably my most favourite thing that came out of last year, is Chromecast. So Chromecast is simply an HDMI dongle that you can put in the back of an internet-enabled TV. It then connects your device via Wi-Fi to your TV. Any app, so for example, iPlayer, YouTube, Netflix, that has Chromecast built in, when you hit play, you can choose whether to play on your device or whether to cast it to the TV. I started user testing this back in October, I think, and I took it home, I set it all up, I put it on both Android and iOS. On iOS, I switched on Screen Curtain, which is when you have voiceover running, but you turn off the screen. I started navigating and I started playing my favourite show on TV. I literally jumped up and down on my sofa. My 4-year-old looked at me like I'd gone absolutely crackers, but that's pretty much by the day. This is a significant thing, I think, because all of the, you can bypass the tricky, inaccessible remote control, which quite frankly we all lose anyway. Who loses their phone? And you bypass the also sometimes inaccessible TV UI, which are difficult to read, difficult to understand, it's difficult to use the inputs for search. If you can use your device, which you know is accessible and you're comfortable using, then it's an absolute win. We've also actually considered dropping our TV subscription and just going down the Chromecast route. And what's key to remember here is it's a one-off £30 fee, $40 if you're in the States. So quite good for people on low income and if you don't have an awful lot of money to chuck at TV. Other ways of adding value, I think, favoriting, that's something that's come up a lot on the list where I listen into what blind users are saying about iPlayer. Favorites are very important. It's a quick and easy way to get back in. So favoriting your last visited, read later, so consider adding those into your designs. If you have a favorites page, consider how you can improve that. Can you filter it? Do you put the most recent favorited thing first? Just give people those tools that will help. And also remember preferences. We have something called Playlister on BBC, which allows you to favorite any music that you like. So currently it's available in radio, but it's just a very quick and easy way that you're looking through listings, you're listening to Radio 6 at the same time, and you can just quickly add things to your watch list. Another favorite app of mine is Shazam, and this blows my mind, the kinds of things that Shazam could be used for, but what it does now is it auto tags sound, and specifically it's used for music. So if there's something playing, you hit the Shazam button, it will find what it is and it will save it in your favorites. The potential this has for TV is significant. You could Shazam a film, find out who is in the film, find out the details about the film without having to spend time navigating around to find stuff. So if we could have a Shazam button in our apps, that would all be lovely. It's basically a good example of how you can second screen your life. Mobile is a great way of showing the convergence between life and apps. Prior to mobile really being sort of a decent proposition, let's say sort of pre-iOS, for example, a lot of people, blind users would have a geolocation device, a braille taker, a laptop, all sorts of different hardware and devices, but now you can pack it into one small device, which is guaranteed to be accessible. And these types of apps are the apps which have the potential to add value to what we do day to day. So those are those are our approaches. Those are my kind of keep this in mind when you're designing, keep this in mind when you're thinking about what to add into the next product. And I'm going to go over a few of the key techniques for inclusive design. This is in no way exhaustive, but these are the ones which, if you're going to do anything, make sure these bubble to the surface. Color contrast is the obvious one. You need to have a contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1. If you have bold, larger text, then you can decrease the contrast and play around with it. There's a number of color contrast checkers you can use to make sure that you reach that requirement. There's Snoop.ca, but there's also the color contrast analyzer, and I'm not just plugging TPG because I'm here, but that is my favorite app. It's a downloadable app, and you can use it on anything, and it's got a really dead easy color picker, so you don't have to rummage around in the CSS and spend time doing that. The other thing to think about with color contrast, which does get missed an awful lot, is color blindness. We made a mistake on our football tables in that we have win, draw, and lose, and they're indicated using color. Obviously not a great thing, color alone. And they're used red and green. So on the top of the screen on the right, I have a screen grab of it just without any color, without Can you hear me now? I'm hoping you can hear me now. I've got a feeling. Woohoo! So that was your interlude. I hope you've got a nice cup of coffee, a tea, a vodka tonic, or whatever your tipple is. Let's get back to getting started then. So on the top right, we have, apologies about that, everybody. On the top right, we have a screen grab, and you can see it when you don't have colorblind issues. And then using the C plugin for Chrome, I've got a second screen grab, and you can see that the red, green, and grey have just become like a little line of sludge, which is no good to anybody. Equally, very difficult for people to understand regardless of colour blindness issues. So that was a fault with the design, and the problem was this was published, this was out there, it was done and dusted. So all we could do is go back and see how we could fix what was there. We couldn't go back and redesign it, and that's the problem of not dealing with accessibility at UX. If it had been caught at that stage, then I think this table might have looked a bit different. What we did in the end was put in a tooltip, which is available on Focus and on Hover, which tells you what the score is for win, draw, and lose. So not ideal, but it's a hack, and that's the problem. So colour and meaning, I'm sure most of you will have an idea around colour and meaning, but use colour to reinforce meaning. Don't use it to convey meaning alone. And this is where I think you can really focus in on your brand, and you can focus in on the comprehension, on cognitive understanding around your site. So use it to reinforce layout, location, active and selected. On BBC, on our main global navigation, we have, when you tab or hover over the BBC products, news, sport, weather, iPlayer, etc., the brand's colour appears as an underline. It's a really kind of nice way of communicating brand, but also communicating focus as well. Don't just use colour alone. I have pictures of subtitle buttons showing an on and off state. Now, if you've only got two states for on and off, who's to know which one means on and which one means off? Would it be pink or would it be black? So consider adding in borders or patterns or font weights around that. I'm quite keen on products or brands using their brand colour as their active state. I think that sort of communicates something quite positive, and it makes sense to me. So people like Spotify are doing it. You see, I've got a screen grab here of their navigation, and looking down their left-hand side, they have a yellow line, a green line just beside the browse link, and that's replicated on an overview link within the page. So you know you're in the browse section, and you know that within that tab panel, which it is within the page, that you're in the overview. So visible focus. Provide hover, focus, and active states. You can use the browser default, but I don't think they're always that clear, and also they don't look pretty, so you don't feel like you are included if you're someone who's using a keyboard or alternative input. So just simply replicating the hover looks much better. Active states must be unique from hover and focus states as well. Typically this gets overlooked, if not most of the time, all of the time. So what I have on screen is we've got the top left, we've got an inactive state of a subtitle button, which is black, an inactive hover, which is pink, and then the active state, which is black with a pink underline, and the active hover, which is pink with a sort of dark mauvey underline. So you kind of get the hint that you're in iPlayer, which is the brand, and you know when you've got subtitles switched on. This needs to be developed or thought about and documented during design. The same with page structure. Now, I spoke earlier about how Colin was having all these issues with iPlayer and navigating around the page and the headings and understanding where he was. I firmly believe that UX needs to think about the structure of the page during wireframing. It's going to change as you design more and as you iterate more, but you need to have the foundation there. So you need to understand what is a paragraph, what's a heading, what's a subheading, what's an ordered list, what's an unordered list, and what are the landmarks. You don't need to know for headings, you don't have to know the code, you don't have to know, the H1 to H6. Simply have a clear idea, this is my page heading, this is my subheading, this is my third level heading. For landmarks, a little bit of know-how is necessary. I'm not going to go into the whole kind of ins and outs of landmarks. I think that's going to be covered many times today. But landmarks mark up the page that other semantic markup can't reach. So you might have a landmark around content, and a screen reader user can navigate to that content. So looking at the wireframe I have on the right, which is a very basic wireframe with navigation at the top, sub-navigation on the left, main content to the right of that, and related articles to the right of that with the content info. This is how I would carve it up and add in the structure and what I would want UX teams to do. So there is a landmark for banner, so we put that all the way around the top of the page. Included within banner, there might be a navigation landmark. The sub-navigation would then have a navigation landmark with a sub-heading. Next to that, you'd have a main landmark, and that would have a main heading in it, and the main heading, all the headings for landmarks where they exist, need to follow exactly in the content order. And then there'd be complementary landmark with headings and third level headings for any items or lists within there. The outcome of that means that a screen reader user will be able to navigate around the page. They'll be able to easily understand the landscape, if you like, of the page and jump not just between headings where you have shortcuts to do that, but also jump between landmarks. Content order is extremely important. So visual presentation does affect content order. So how you design will ultimately affect the output of content. I have two pictures here of two menus which contain links to other items. So the top menu is on the BBC main global navigation. It's a more menu. You open it up and you have rows of links, and the reading order is to go across the rows of links, so left to right, next row, left to right. The second box down below shows a switcher where you can choose different regions within the UK. These are coded so that they read down in columns. Now, the problem with responsive design and making that work means that we then have to split what should be actually two lists, one for Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, and the rest for regions within England. What should be two lists then gets split into one list. So Northern Ireland and Scotland at the top left in the first column get read as one list. Wales gets read as one list, and then Cambridge to Northwest a third, and Oxfordshire to Yorkshire a fourth, which is really, really quite confusing. Focus order is really important. Pop-outs, fly-out menus, expand and collapse features, next and previous. Obviously, developers take care of it, but you need to define in UX, where does the focus go after I hit this submit button or this next or this previous button? Where possible, you want to use design standards and standard interactions that people will be familiar with, not just sort of across the web, but also have a standard defined within your organization. We've standardized how we do mini in-page carousels. On the bottom, I've got a mini carousel of video and audio, and we have in it 3 items. You hit a next button, and you get another 3, next, and another 3. We've basically taken the next button out of the content order. So as far as the screen reader is concerned, they just have a list of 9 items. They don't need to know that it's designed in such a way. Touch targets are also very important. If you go back to the Android design guidelines, iOS design guidelines, research from Jakob Nielsen, they pretty much all point to using 7mm 44 pixels. So as your minimum touch target size. So you would have a button that would be that size or a link that would be that size, but sometimes you might have something that necessarily it has to be a little bit smaller. That's fine. Visually it can be smaller, but you need to make sure that the clearance area around it is still 44. So for example, we've got a picture of the media player on the right, and we have a slider where you can put your finger on and you can forward wind and rewind. The actual button on the slider is 32, but we've got a clearance area of 44 pixels around it. Ways to integrate inclusive design into the process. So this is a work in progress, I should say, at BBC. I don't think it's something that ever stops, and that's probably a good thing. It's good to keep on your toes, but these are a few things that we are starting to do and integrate. User research is essential. And I will stick my hand up here and say I'm extremely lucky to work in an organisation where that is at the core of many of our products. but it's vital that you include disabled users within it. Remember what I said earlier on about you need to add value, but you can't make assumptions about what people might want. Test your ideas, test your concepts. Include users from all disability groups and with a minimum of 2 users per group. I would say also try and include people with extreme disabilities. You don't want someone to recruit 2 deaf users who are only partially deaf in one ear, because that's not going to really help you when you're testing subtitles, for example. Allow for home-based and lab-based testing, be accommodating in what people might need. People might not be able to test for long, they might need their own setup, or they might be comfortable using the lab setup. Sarah Horton is doing a presentation later on today, and I strongly recommend that you go and listen to her because she's great. So we've done some user testing recently. We had a situation within the standard media player, which is the media player we're using across BBC, which we've been standardizing, whereby in iPlayer, which is our playback service, if you were in full screen and you interact and you have subtitles on and you interact with the player controls would go over slightly the subtitles, so you couldn't read them. If you opened up more information, then they would become obscured entirely by that more information. I spoke to an expert and he said, well, to be honest, Henny, that's what people expect. That always happens. Nobody ever gets to have subtitles and other information. I didn't feel that was right, because I think you should always challenge the norm. I spoke to one of the guys in UX who happens to be deaf and deaf since birth and a subtitle user. And he says, well, you know, that's what we get, but we don't want that. So we went and commissioned some research to try and understand where we should be positioning the subtitles. So we took 24 participants, people who were culturally deaf, so deaf since birth, hard of hearing, and we also had a portion who were not deaf, because we know that a lot of people use subtitles on and off within the player. The outcome was not surprising to us, but sometimes you need to do a bit of user research to validate what you think. And we found that the preferred approach was to, one, never obscure subtitles, and then to position them on top of the screen or just above the revealed content. What we learned was we didn't want to put them in the middle of the screen, obviously, because then you obscure people's mouths when they're speaking and people want to lip read at the same time. We did this we did the testing on desktop, mobile and devices. We had cutouts of the subtitles in different sizes, and we asked people to position it where they wanted. So the outcome really was, if you're in full screen, you're watching a program, you're reading your subtitles, you interact with the player controls, as I'm showing on screen here, so the player controls are now revealed, subtitles move up, and then, because when you open up more information takes up almost sort of half of the screen, so if you were to put subtitles in the middle, then you would absolutely be sort of covering the action. So we then push subs up to the top. We are doing some work to bring subtitles down a little bit so they don't go into the black letterboxing around the video player. So process, annotate your wireframes. So everything that we've spoken about in the techniques, you need to annotate your wireframes in design. So structure, content order, focus order, touch target size. You can do it in whatever way you want to do it, whatever way works for your teams. For the Olympics, we built a media player that we intended to have full screen reader access in. And what we did was we took a screenshot of the player controls, and literally we put an outline around each player control in the order of the tab order, and we described what the label was and the description if it had a description. So that's what I'm showing on screen now. The player controls with lots of information around what that particular one button does, which happens to be the play button. Next button in the tab order is the volume, and then we put in the description and the labels for how the volume works there. A different way of doing it is up on screen now. I have a picture of the new iPlayer and the carousel, and here we've dissected where the headings are, where the lists are, and we've got everything boxed and lines going to everything. So when somebody from development takes this from UX, there's a lot of questions they don't need to bother UX with. It's all been there and it's all annotated. You need to produce style guides as well, so that's sort of different from annotated UX, and you should be doing that for products anyway, but sometimes that doesn't happen. So document your color contrast, text, links, navigation, focus states. Color and meaning, so navigation, locations, layout and brand, hover focus and active states, as well as touch targets as well. So to wrap up my last 10 minutes, this is a picture of the new iPlayer. I showed you a picture of the old iPlayer at the beginning. It's been cleaned up significantly, so you have the BBC Burlesque, the framework navigation at the top. Underneath that you have iPlayer navigation. On the left of the screen we have what we refer to as Find Tools, which is comprised of a search, an A to Z and a recently watched. To the right of that, in the main body, we have a very large homepage carousel where we showcase all the popular content. So everything that you might want in terms of tools to get to where you're going, if you have somewhere you know where you're going, is there high up in the content order. But if you're there to browse, equally, we make that very readily available as well. So the primary information is placed at the start of the page. So where before we had things like the TV channels and the categories and the A to Z halfway down the page, they're now all in the navigation at the top, the iPlayer navigation at the top. So primary information first. That's where people naturally look with their eye. For screen magnification user, when you magnify the screen up, you're only going to get the top left-hand corner initially when you download a page. And for screen reader users, you can also get to content quickly. So you're designing to help that. On the left, with the discovery tools, we from our stats, we know that people love A to Z and finding programs, and we added in recently watched, so you could see what your last watched program was and quickly go in and get to the next episode. We also managed keyboard tab order, so if you tab around the page, when you go from categories, which is the last item in the sub-navigation, you tab and go onto the search icon, this overlay opens up. You tab into it and then you get a message to tell you that there are items that match what you're looking for underneath. And you can then tab down through that drop down and you can navigate to the popular heading to find the popular results or the latest results or the A to Z results. When you tab away from that, because the A to Z is also an overlay, we shut that overlay automatically. And for that reason, we've taken the close button out of the tab order. We also manage navigation, keyboard access and swipe access on the next and previous buttons on the carousel. So these are also taken out of the tab order. So essentially what you get is just a list of items. The carousel is not a true carousel, it's not continuous. If it was, then we would do something different. But you just go from beginning to end, and you can hold down your tab key and go very, very quickly. So it doesn't have to be lots of hard work tabbing. So, summary. Design with choice in mind. Give people different ways of completing an action. Everybody benefits, everybody wins. You win as well as a product because people get to complete what they come to your site to do. Always give users control over the page. Never assume people want to do it one way. A recent one for me was autoplay. We assume that autoplay is not good to have on video. One of the reasons being that people don't know where the pause button is if they're first-time users, and it drowns out your screen reader. I actually had a screen reader user who uses the iPlayer catch-up service, and he said, I want autoplay on everything because then I can just autoplay. I don't have to spend time navigating to try and get to the play button, which is hard work for me. Prioritize features that add value for disabled users. So when you're in that kickoff meeting and you're thinking about, shall we ramp up the favorites section or shall we add in a recently watched, think about, okay, actually what are the benefits for this type of user and this type of user. Use standard components, keep things familiar, and integrate accessibility into annotated wireframes, design, and UX. And finally, make no assumptions. Always test ideas and concepts with the user, because user research is one of the most eye-opening and one of the most brilliant aspects of web design. You just learn something every single day. So thank you. I think we've got 5 minutes for questions. I didn't really keep up with the chat box. I'll scroll back up, but if you did ask a question and I missed it, if you could just perhaps copy paste it back in, then I won't miss it again.
I don't think there were any questions that I noticed, Henny. So yeah, if anybody's got questions, feel free to type them.
Multiple attendees are typing. Uh-oh. I will put these up on SlideShare as well.
In the meantime, I had a really quick question, if I'm allowed, since I'm the only one that can speak.
Yep.
I've seen this before, and I never got a straight answer from other people. Things when you mentioned these 44 pixels for your controls, having your folders of that size. What kind of pixel are we talking about? I mean, it will depend on the device size, viewing distance. Does it relate to roughly the idealized CSS pixel here?
Yeah, I think that's a tricky one as well. I mean, I would go back to the platform specific guidelines to see how they recommend it, and then take it from there. But we've in our global experience language team, in our GEL team, we have a guy who's been researching that, and that's probably a question I would need to take back to him, if I'm honest. So Jess has a question. With creating annotated wireframes and design docs, how does this fit into agile lean UX designing in the browser? Well, if you design in the browser, then you can add this stuff in. You can add in a landmark. You can add in your heading stuff. You can put that framework in rather than just describe it. So it's almost better. But the one thing I have noticed that can be problematic with working in agile is quite often designs are not finalized and the code is already being written. I think in that instance, what you need to do is make sure that you're really early on wireframes are annotated and are decided. Anything you slap over the top will obviously change it and update it, but you need to have the core in place initially, and then sort of when designs do start to change, etc., it will, if there are problems with that, then it will bubble to the surface and you can track it better. Bruce is asking where I bought that jumper. It wasn't even Primark, Pat, it was just the charity shop down the road. They're good in Brighton. Any other questions? We've got 2 minutes. Oh, there's a big one. Hold on. Why companies hire a separate accessibility guy and team? You're not a developer. I'm just going to take the first question at the start, Jatindra, and I'm going to read it all offline because I've only got 2 minutes. But why companies hire a separate accessibility guy in a team who is not a developer? I think it's down to the company as to who they hire. It's also down to who's available. You know, there are people who are more developer orientated, more design orientated. I think in different countries there's different types of availability as well. It also depends on who is hiring within that company. Quite often the requirement for an accessibility specialist comes from the development team. Certainly it did sort of when I came in, but I've kind of deliberately shifted my focus over to UX because that's where I feel it needs to be. I think also I worry about accessibility specialist silos. I think what we should be doing is enabling people rather than solving problems on one particular product. And our approach here at BBC is to pull back from consultancy on specific products and focus more on fixing shared modules across the whole site. So I work on the media player that is delivered across the entirety of BBC. It's a one service thing and it's pretty core to what we do. I think I should probably stop. Sorry. You can tweet me some questions if you like.
Thank you very much, Henny, for that. That was a great presentation.